One thing we should be cautious about when it comes to thinking about cultures and their different kinds of moral rules is it's helpful to make a distinction between judgments about prudence, that is wisdom, what we should do in terms of intervention, say, and ethical judgments. We might choose not to get involved in another culture's unethical practice for a host of prudential reasons, all the while recognizing that the practice, say, of female genital mutilation is in fact an unethical practice. So, in other words, we're not going to evade Somalia or in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, these other countries who allow this to go on, just because, not because we think it's not an ethical issue, but because we're making judgments about prudence, about what's the best thing to do. We also need to obviously distinguish between mere conventions and unethical practices. Tea is at 4 is something that happens in the United Kingdom, but that's not an ethical practice or an unethical practice. Whereas the practice in India, there was a practice called sati, S-A-T-I, in which widows were, through social pressure, made to sacrifice their lives on a bonfire when their husbands died as an act of honoring their marriage and their husband who is now deceased. Women would quite literally walk into a burning pile and give their lives, and the women who didn't were socially ostracized, sometimes beaten, and sometimes killed. When the British colonial powers took over India, one of the things they changed was sati. And they said, no, we're not going to allow that sort of cultural practice. So that's an unethical practice that was stopped by the British. And then, even if moralities differ from society to society, it need not follow that morality itself is relative from place to place. So, for example, we need to look. So, one challenge for any view of morality, if you believe in an objective moral code, is can you come up, are there some objectively binding moral obligations, something that's true in all cultures? If we could find even one, it would disprove moral skepticism and it would disprove cultural relativism. Is there some moral principle that is binding on all cultures? If we were in class, I would ask you all that question. And many of you would answer by saying things like, well, sure, there are some things that are binding in all cultures. The protection of the young, for example, or prohibitions against murder or killing. And those seem to be good candidates for an objectively binding moral obligation. Imagine a society that had no regard whatever for its young, wouldn't feed them, wouldn't house them, wouldn't clothe them, nothing. Well, that society would not live long enough to propagate itself. Secondly, imagine a society that thought murder was no different than tying your shoes. There's no prohibition against murder. Well, again, such a society would not last to the second generation. So it seems as if certain kinds of principles that allow a society to exist are likely to be morally binding. Now, some would argue that these are rooted in what we call sociobiology, the idea that there are certain ethical principles all people or all societies have because they are conducive to survival of our species. So the idea, for example, that cultures universally value their young. It doesn't mean that they value every single one of their young. The Aztecs, we know, for example, sacrificed children to their gods. But they didn't sacrifice all of their children to their gods. It was only certain ones and was for a certain purpose. So it seems like the protection of the young, prohibition against murder, prohibition against lying, those kinds of things that are necessary ethical principles for the survival of a species are likely to be the things we're going to find in every culture. And if so, we have a universal moral code. No matter why they came about, it's still universal. So that's a discussion of cultural relativism. Let's pause for a moment and talk about logical positivism. This is a philosophical view that grew up that gives rise to a certain kind of subjective relativism. So let's talk about logical positivism for just a minute. It arose out of our good friend David Hume. You remember David Hume says there are two kinds of statements. Analytical statements, which he called matters of fact. Not matters of fact. Those are relations of ideas, and synthetic statements, which are matters of fact. Relations of ideas or analytical statements are things like, you may recall, all bachelors are single. Synthetic statements are things like the coronavirus is ravaging the world. Those are synthetic kinds of statements. Synthetic statements are true when we discover them to be true. They're out there, as it were. And analytical statements are simply true by the definition of the terms. So if you apply Hume's understanding of language, sentences, to ethical principles, you have to try to think about where do they fit. So here's one. Killing children for fun is wrong. Now that's an ethical claim. I agree with it. I think you do too. Is it an analytic statement? Is it true by definition? Do the words there mean wrong? I think we look at that and say, no, that's not like the sentence, triangles have three sides, or all bachelors are single. Well, how about it? Maybe it's synthetic. Maybe it's a discovery. Something like Everest is the tallest mountain. Is killing children for fun is wrong like that? Well, again, it doesn't look to be a statement like that, like I have 3 dogs or something. It's not a synthetic statement. Well, the logical positivist said if a sentence is neither analytical nor synthetic, then maybe it's meaningless. There are all kinds of meaningless sentences, but it seems like the sentence killing children for fun certainly has meaning, so it doesn't fit into that. The only other area logical positivism allowed was the idea of inner feelings. There are certain sentences we speak that are about our inner dispositions or our inner states or our subjective feelings. And this is where they said ethics resides. It's about our own personal likes and dislikes. That philosophy that they developed out of logical positivism is called emotivism. Now, emotivism is the idea that ethical claims are equivalent to personal preferences. They're not analytical, they're not about the world, they're not discovered, they're simply about my preferences. So here's a sentence you may have heard in the last year or so. That may be your truth, but it's not my truth. Notice truth is not out there, it's inside your heart. That's what's true to you. So ethics is about personal preferences, personal stances. This is called subjective relativism. It's simply my own way of thinking about it. It's a form of subjective relativism. So just as cultural relativism says ethics is relative from one culture to the next, so subjective relativism says ethics is relative from one person to the next. And what's right for you is right for you. What's wrong for me is wrong for me. And there may not be any connection between the two of those. Some perceived advantages, and here you'll see some echo of cultural relativism, is that it ends moral debate. Good. Not so much yelling on the various news programs if positivism or emotivism is true. Ethics is simply a matter of taste. We don't argue about whether you should like boiled okra or whether I should like macaroni and cheese. It simply is the case. We might ask someone, hey, try this food and see if you like it. But once their reaction to it ends an argument about it. And if that's what ethics is something like saying, under this view, I don't like killing children. I don't prefer that. Now, happily, the defenders of emotivism would say most all human beings are the same in our preferences. And so that's why we tend to agree about morality. But it boils down to simply our own personal preference. Another perceived advantage is that it promotes tolerance. Now you'll see there that I've left a question mark. by that. I'm not sure it does promote tolerance. What if someone's personal preference is to be intolerant? Do I have to allow for that? It's not their intolerance is no better than my tolerance, is it? Remember, there is no better. There's simply preferences. Their intolerance of, let's say, if a perceived advantage, why isn't racism okay? If someone's a racist, shouldn't I simply say, well, that's just a different taste to have? But of course, that's not the way we think about ethics. And so I'm not sure it does promote tolerance, especially imagine a racist who wants to act out on his racism in some violent way. We're not going to say, well, that's just their personal preferences. We're going to say, no, they can't do that because it's wrong. And that's the problem with emotivism. Like we saw with cultural relativism, it might at first glance appear to promote tolerance, but it does not allow for a genuine tolerance of difference, because it really recognizes that differences are not moral differences, they're just differences of preference. Excuse me. So one of the problems, as I've mentioned, with subjective relativism is that it contradicts our moral intuitions. I tend to think about someone like a Jeffrey Dahmer, who was a cannibal. I don't look at his morality and say, well, he just had different tastes than I do. There's something deeper here. I'm not a paragon of virtue by any means, but I don't think the differences between us are simply a matter of personal taste. There were things that he was doing that no human being should do to another. So subjective relativism really contradicts our moral intuitions. It goes against the idea that we can even have moral disagreements. And here the point is, but we do have moral disagreements. Pro-life people argue against pro-choice people. People who want to allow more immigration argue against those who want to restrict it. People right now are attacking Donald Trump and our administration for the handling of the coronavirus. All kinds of things are happening like that. Now, I'm not arguing about which side is right on that. My point is, if subjective relativism is true, then the entire disagreement is ridiculous. It's about arguing. If subjective relativism is true, it's equivalent to arguing about your taste in food. And that seemed to be just a waste of time. It treats all moral claims as equal. But of course, they aren't equal. Murder is worse than jaywalking. And yet, if you feel strongly about jaywalking, it's a stronger preference for you, I suppose. But that seems just absurd. It would seem to justify just absolutely reprehensible outcomes. Imagine, if you can, I know this is a delicate subject, but imagine if you can the Columbine situation, the Parkland shooting. What was there, according to subjective relativism, what was the real problem with the shooters in all these cases? It seems to me they would have to say that they just had a different set of preferences than their victims did. Because ethics is only about a matter of preference, about likes and dislikes, about desires. And yet, I think when we hear about, or maybe have been touched by terrible calamities like this, tragedies, these violence, we think these people have done something wrong. If you've ever had violence done to you, you look at it as something that the person should not have done. It's not a matter of personal taste. And that is a very powerful, strong argument against this way of thinking about ethics. So we've looked so far at cultural relativism, at subjective relativism, and emotivism that gave rise to subjective relativism. And we've looked at a few terms of terminology and some assumptions of ethics. As we move on in the course, now we'll begin to drill down into some specific ethical theories that have been very influential today. All of those ethical theories will agree with the assumptions of ethics, and they will reject both cultural relativism and subjective relativism. I hope you enjoyed listening today. I hope to see you all very soon. Goodbye.